Look at a photograph of a wolf. Now look at a golden retriever. Same species, essentially, separated by a few tens of thousands of years of living alongside us. The wolf has a long snout, a heavy jaw, a lean face, sharp pricked ears. The retriever has a shorter face, softer features, floppy ears, and a permanent expression of gentle stupidity. We did that. We took an apex predator and turned it into something that sleeps on a couch. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if the exact same thing happened to us? What if, at some point in our deep past, human beings started doing to themselves what we later did to wolves? And what if the face you see in the mirror every morning is the result? That's not a metaphor. It's a serious scientific hypothesis, and it's called human self-domestication. And once you understand the evidence behind it, you can never look at your own species the same way again. Let's start with a strange fact that puzzled biologists for over a century. When you domesticate an animal, you don't just get a tamer version of it, you get a whole package of changes that seem to have nothing to do with each other. Domesticated animals tend to have shorter faces and smaller jaws, smaller teeth, more delicate, less robust skeletons, slightly smaller brains, floppy ears instead of pricked ones, curly tails, patches of white fur, especially on the face and chest. And behaviorally, they stay playful and curious into adulthood, instead of growing out of it like their wild relatives do. Biologists call this bundle the domestication syndrome. And it's genuinely bizarre, because nobody ever bred an animal for floppy ears. No farmer in history looked at a herd and thought, I want the one with the curly tail. They selected for one thing and one thing only, an animal that wouldn't bite them. Tameness. Everything else came along for the ride, uninvited. Why would that happen? The leading explanation involves something called neural crest cells. These are cells that appear very early in embryonic development and then migrate throughout the growing body, where they end up forming an oddly assorted list of things: parts of the face and jaw, the pigment cells that color skin and fur, cartilage in the ears, teeth, and crucially, the adrenal glands, which produce the fight or flight response. So if you select an animal for being calmer, you're effectively selecting for slightly weaker adrenal function, which means selecting for a slightly reduced supply of neural crest cells. And because those same cells are building the face, the ears, the teeth, and the pigment, all of those things get subtly altered too. Select for a calm animal, and you accidentally get a shorter face, floppier ears, and white patches. It's a package deal. We know this works because it's been demonstrated in real time. Starting in the late 1950s, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev ran one of the most famous experiments in the history of biology. He took silver foxes, genuinely wild, aggressive animals, and bred them for exactly one trait: tolerance of humans. That's it. Only the calmest foxes in each generation were allowed to breed. Within a few dozen generations, he had foxes that wagged their tails and ran to greet people. But he also got something he never selected for. Those foxes started developing floppy ears, curly tails, piebald white patches on their fur, shorter, rounder snouts. The domestication syndrome appeared on its own, in a matter of decades, simply from selecting for gentleness. Which brings us to the disturbing part. Look at that list of traits again. Shorter face, smaller teeth, more delicate skeleton, reduced aggression, playfulness retained into adulthood. Now look at us. Compare a modern human skull to that of our ancestors, or to a Neanderthal. The differences are striking. Our brow ridges, the heavy bony shelf above the eyes, have almost vanished. Our faces are dramatically shorter and flatter. Our teeth are smaller. Our bones are thinner and less robust. And researchers have measured this systematically. In one influential study, scientists compared the skulls of early Homo sapiens who lived before 80,000 years ago with those of humans from the last 38,000 years, and found a clear, measurable trend. Brow ridges shrank and the upper face shortened. Men's skulls, in particular, became more similar in shape to women's, a pattern the researchers called craniofacial feminization. And that matters because heavy brows and long faces are strongly associated with testosterone exposure. Lower testosterone reactivity means lower reactive aggression, the hot-tempered, impulsive kind of violence. In other words, our skulls appear to be recording, in bone, a species that was getting steadily less hot-headed. Some researchers argue this process started remarkably early. The oldest known Homo sapiens fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco are around 315,000 years old. And they already show shortened faces, smaller teeth, and reduced brow ridges compared to what came before, which suggests that whatever was taming us had already been at work for a very long time. So who was doing the taming? With dogs, the answer is easy: us. But nobody was domesticating humans. There was no farmer selecting the calmest specimens. So the hypothesis, championed most prominently by Harvard's Richard Wrangham, is that we did it to ourselves, and the mechanism is genuinely dark. In our closest relatives, chimpanzees, the strongest and most aggressive male typically dominates. He bullies, he intimidates, and he gets disproportionate access to mates. Aggression pays. But somewhere in our lineage, something changed that equation, and that something was probably language and weapons. Once you can talk, you can conspire. Once weapons exist, a group of ordinary ordinary males can kill the strongest individual among them while he sleeps. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherers document exactly this. The worst bullies, the men who steal wives or murder, are sometimes executed by group consensus, not in a duel, by collective decision. And if that pattern held over hundreds of thousands of years, the consequence is enormous. The most aggressive men in each generation would have been systematically removed from the gene pool, not by predators, not by rival tribes, but by their own communities. Humans began executing the humans who couldn't get along. Wrangham's argument is that this is our domestication, a relentless, self-inflicted selection against reactive aggression, running for 300,000 years or more. And the results are measurable. Despite everything you see in the news, humans are extraordinarily tolerant animals in everyday life. Studies estimate that rates of within-group aggressive conflict in humans are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude lower than in wild chimpanzees. That's not twice as peaceful. That's hundreds of times more peaceful. Think about what you did today. You may have sat in a metal tube with hundreds of strangers, packed shoulder to shoulder, nobody was killed, put a few hundred unfamiliar chimpanzees on an airplane, and you would not land with a full complement of passengers. Our capacity to sit calmly among strangers is not normal for a primate. It is a bizarre, engineered-seeming trait, and it may be the single thing that made civilization possible. You cannot have cities, trade, cooperation, or accumulated technology unless individuals can tolerate crowds of non-relatives without exploding. But here's the twist that makes this whole story genuinely unsettling. Wrangham draws a sharp distinction between two kinds of aggression. Reactive aggression is the hot kind, the flash of rage, the bar fight, the impulsive lashing out. That, he argues, is what we bred out of ourselves. But proactive aggression is the cold kind, planned, calculated, deliberate, and that we did not reduce. If anything, the very traits that made us tame, cooperation, planning, coalition building, the ability to conspire against a common enemy, are precisely the traits required for organized violence. The same skill that let a group of ancestors quietly agree to eliminate the village bully is the skill that later produced armies, executions, and genocide. We became the calmest ape in the room and simultaneously the only ape capable of planning a war. Docility and mass violence grew from the same root. Now, a fair caveat. This remains a hypothesis, not settled fact. Some researchers dispute whether the shrinking of our brains and faces really indicates domestication, and the neural crest cell explanation is still being tested and debated. This is a live argument, not a closed case. But the pattern it points at is hard to shake off. We look, anatomically, like a domesticated animal. We behave like one, tolerant, playful, endlessly social, strangely willing to be crowded. Nobody put us in a pen or bred us for gentleness. We did it to ourselves, over thousands of generations, by refusing to tolerate the cruelest among us. Every time you sit peacefully next to a stranger, you're demonstrating the result. We are not the wolves of this story. We are the dogs, and we're the ones who did the breeding.